Thanks for coming to this, the launch of the Critique, Influence, Change series published by Zed Books. Just a brief note on our rationale for the series. Despite the global economic crisis, despite movements and certain governments around the world seeking and implementing alternatives, the global political left still has a way to go in terms of moving beyond critique and opposition and achieving fundamental change. Each book in this series, however, does precisely that. This is a collection of books that have instigated paradigm shifts in their respective fields. They're books that offer viable and practical alternatives for a better world.
In my opinion, there's a problem with ideas on the left, that there isn't a kind of single unifying idea, there isn't a sort of single unifying ideology that we all have as members of the left anymore. The Soviet Union used to be the sort of living embodiment of socialism, not necessarily the desirable embodiment of socialism, but it was the sort of living embodiment of an alternative to capitalism. But I feel that since that collapsed, and there are lots of mixed opinions about whether that was a good or a bad thing for the left, but I feel that one thing that it did do was it sort of set in this idea of what Mark Fisher calls capitalist realism, which is this kind of all-encompassing idea of capitalism, the idea that it was kind of an event horizon of capitalism. Nothing ever came before, and you couldn't imagine anything afterwards. In fact, there's this famous quote that's often attributed to Zizek, but I've heard been attributed to other people, which is, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And I think that that's because with the end of the world, you can imagine that happening because you don't have to think of what would come afterwards. But with the end of capitalism, you'd have to imagine an alternative to that. And I don't know about you, but that does set me in a kind of blind panic when I try and think about what an alternative to capitalism would look like. Because I've never lived in an alternative to capitalism. I don't feel that I have any tangible experience of that. Is there a problem with the dearth of ideas? That's what I want to talk about. Is there a dearth of ideas on the left? Or is it that we have lots of ideas, like we have Ha-Joon here today? We've got some excellent work that's been done by Oxfam recently on inequality. We've got the ideas of people like Mariana Mazzucato, who's writing really important things about the state at the moment. Thomas Piketty, who's the new star economist on the left. So is it that there are ideas, but we just don't have one single unifying idea? Is the problem that we don't have concrete structures, that unions are weak, that the Labour Party is a sort of write-off? Is that a problem? Or is it that structures are the things that have always been holding us back, and that what has made things like Occupy and UK Uncut so successful is a lack of structure? Owen Jones, a friend of mine, wrote an article about the left following the recent deaths of Tony Benn and Bob Crow. And he said something that really resonated with me in that article. He said, "What surely must drive all shades of the left is a sense of necessity." And I really like that because at times when I feel quite sort of despondent about the left, which is very frequently, it is the sense of necessity that keeps me going and gives me hope, because it has always been historically the left that has delivered equality, that has delivered justice, and that has delivered peace. And I think that at a time when living standards are falling, when equality is a massive problem, when there's the sort of threat of turbulence abroad, and when the poorest people in this country are being made to, I know it's a sort of cliche phrase, but being made to pay for a crisis that they didn't cause. We need justice more than ever. So I think probably one thing that we're all in agreement with here is that the left, it might be not at its best at the moment, but it's probably more necessary than ever. So I'd like to talk about what we do. Where do we go? And on that note, we're not going to leave here until we've completely rebuilt the left. So seal the exits. Let's get talking. I'm
often described as a heterodox economist, but actually I don't like the term because once again it's a relative concept. In the 1970s, Keynesians were the orthodox economists. Friedman was the heterodox guy. So we need to be kind of agile about this and need to imagine be more imaginative, if you like. So, when you actually look at real life experiences, a lot of things have been done when people kind of stop believing in this rigid kind of the dividing lines and try to be more imaginative. So, for example, in the late 19th century, orthodox Marxists did not like the welfare state. It's basically co-opting the workers into the capitalist system. The guy who actually first implemented the welfare state was none other than Otto von Bismarck, the arch-conservative. I mean, he was a bit cleverer than other conservatives because he really wanted to preserve the system. So he said, yes, I mean, all this socialist agitation is very dangerous because a lot of what they say is true. So we need to diffuse that. I mean, others were stupid and said, no, we cannot make that concession. But actually, he and some others made a concession. So in the beginning, for example, the German Social Democratic Party was very resistant to this idea, and they criticized the Swedes for going for that kind of option, calling them revisionist and all manner of things. But then, today Sweden is more socialist than Germany, at least according to some definitions. So I think we need to be more flexible, not new labor flexible, but you have to have some minimum standard, but be more kind of flexible in what we think is a labor left policy or right policy. And one short comment on trade unions. The interesting thing is that trade unions are stronger in countries like Germany and the Netherlands, despite the fact that they have a lower unionization ratio than the UK or Italy. So it's not just numbers game. I mean, how do you, represent your trade union movement as kind of defenders of greater good rather than sectional interests? I think that was the failure with some of the British trade union the movement. Anyway, let's leave it there.
Duncan.
Blimey.
Some to follow.
Okay, I'm going to start from somewhere totally different. So I work for Oxfam, so I'm going to talk about sort of whatever it's called, developing world, the global south, the south, I don't know. Its name keeps changing, but you know what I mean. So a couple of assertions or just points to remember. One is that we've had about 70 years of the most impressive human progress in the history of the species. Let's not get all European doom and gloom. If you think more widely, if you think in terms of things like education, health, the infant mortality rate in America in the 1820s was twice as high as the most impoverished country in Africa now. You've had extraordinary progress over the last 70 years. So just remember that when we all get suicidal. The second point I wanted to make is, are we talking about alternatives to capitalism, in which case I share your gloom, or alternatives to something we call neoliberalism, which is a much more narrow, late 90s Anglo-Saxon version of capitalism? And I think it's much more useful to think about the second. The first just makes you really, really depressed. So a couple of... And the third thing is, once you get outside Europe and outside the UK in particular, there's loads of really exciting stuff happening, and there's loads to learn from, and there's loads of new ideas and new political movements, new social movements, and it's really not nearly as bad as it seems if you have the misfortune to be British. So I want to talk a little bit about what's going on elsewhere. So I'll start with Latin America, because that's where I came in. I wrote a book about alternatives to neoliberalism in 1995. And it was kind of weird being asked to speak about this, because I haven't spoken about this for at least 10, 15 years. And at that point, there was something you could identify as neoliberalism. There was a very crude idea that if you liberalized all markets, if you privatized anything that moved, and if you just let the market rip, people said, we will all be better off. It was that dumb. And you wouldn't find, I think, anybody in Latin America admitting that now. You might find some thinking it, but not very many. There was a kind of heterodox kind of school coming out of the UN, which was saying, actually, we need industrial policy, we need an effective state, which is more intervening in the economy. And there was something called a New Left. The New Left, I mean, you were talking about the travails of the trade unions. Well, in a post-Fordist economy, it's not surprising that trade unions go down. And if you cling to old school trade unions based on large agglomerations of workers in factories, then you're in for trouble. The new left that emerged in Latin America emerged around location, so sort of shantytown type, or identity, indigenous movements, women's movements, and it became quite fragmented and very interesting and fluid. And a lot of the new wave of political parties which have taken power in the last 10 or 15 years emerged from crazy things like coca growers or Catholic-based Christian communities, all sorts of things, produced a really dynamic, new, but very different left to the one we traditionally associate with the left. But it had a real trouble moving, the Spanish phrase is from protesta to propuesta, from protest to proposal. I think it was much better at the protesta, it did that very well. And it also really struggled, I think, to come up with an alternative to neoliberalism. It seems like finding new forms of politics and new forms of social organization is much easier than finding new forms of economic policy which are radically different from the mainstream. And so what you've got at the moment, I think, in Latin America is a lot of these new political and social expressions and a sort of social democrat version of capitalism. And actually it's working rather well, sorry. So Brazil, for example, is the big success story in that it's the rate at which Brazil's reduced inequality over the last 15 years through a combination of economic stability, social policy, better education system than it had, still not great at all, is comparable only to the New Deal in the 1930s in the US. It is amazing the speed of progress in Brazil. So I think there's a lot to learn there, but it has been very hard for even progressive parties in Latin America to step outside financialization.
Politics and power, they are ultimately what matter, because if you have the power, there are people who can work this out. I mean, tax accountants, treasury officials, what have you. So that in a way, you shouldn't get bogged down with this. What's your policy alternative argument? For two reasons. One is, whatever argument you propose, the game's already loaded because the existing structure is there. So a lot of what you say will be, by definition, unrealistic, because the underlying structure is loaded in one way, and if you are talking about alternatives with different values and so on, that is going to look unrealistic. So don't get faced by that kind of counter argument. Oh, is it realistic? And then you tell them, yes. I mean that's what people said when 200 years ago. That people said we should abolish slavery. I mean that's what people said when we asked for female suffrage. I mean at the time the argument was that women lack mental faculty. So that they cannot be treated as full, adult human beings. And a lot of women too argued, we have our husbands and brothers and fathers who can represent our view. We don't want vote. So, first of all, never give in to this argument that, oh, your proposal is unrealistic. But secondly, I think that when people say, oh, you lack details, as Ellie said, if once this becomes an issue, suddenly there'll be some tax accountant, retired tax accountant who volunteers to do the sums for you. There'll be people who can do it. And if you get the office, then you can tell all these economists in the treasury to work the figures out in your way. Of course, it's not that easy because now, even the so-called alternative, the politicians are quite severely brainwashed by this free market ideology, but still, I think that we shouldn't get fazed by this argument that, oh, we want more details, what's your alternative? I think that's a losing game if you kind of play by their rule.